Okay, in this video I'm just going to talk through the process of how we calculate inflation in Australia using the Consumer Price Index. So inflation, first of all, is calculated on a quarterly basis every 3 months, and it's calculated by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. The most common indicator of inflation is the Consumer Price Index, and that's the one we're going to be talking about in this video. So the Consumer Price Index measures the quarterly changes, so every 3 months, in the retail prices of locally made and foreign goods and services. So we're trying to get an indication of the purchasing power of Australians, and because Australians purchase imports, imports are included in the Consumer Price Index. Exports aren't, because they're not things we're spending money on, but it's trying to get a measure of the changes in price of the prices of things that Australians are spending on goods and services, or the retail prices. Only metropolitan households in capital cities are surveyed to determine the weightings that we put into the CPI, and I'll talk about the weightings a little bit later. The ABS go to retail outlets every 3 months, so different stores, supermarkets, mechanics, actually not really mechanics, supermarkets, department stores, anywhere where you buy consumer goods and services, so car yards, and to try and get an indication of the changes in a whole range of goods and services: bread, milk, service industries, cars, etc., etc. It only includes consumer items, so things spent by consumers. It's not talking about changes in businesses. So if businesses are buying machinery or something like that, that's not included in the CPI because it's about consumer spending and the price of consumer goods. So every 3 months they go out to the retail stores to get changes in prices. Then what they do is they collect the price changes, or the change in price of 100,000 different items. So every 3 months they go and look at all 100,000 of these items to see if their prices are going up or down. So the regimen refers to the range of goods and services that are included in the CPI, all 100,000 goods and services, and they are subdivided into 11 categories. The 100,000 goods and services is not everything we buy, but it is the predominantly nearly everything that Australians buy, basically, all 100,000. Not everything, but 100,000 goods and services. They separate them into 11 categories: food, clothing and footwear, housing, and so on and so forth. Each category is given a weighting. Each category is given a weighting based on how much of our income is spent on that category. So in Australia, the highest weighting goes to housing because a higher percentage of our income is spent on housing, then food. And what that basically means is if the price of housing goes up by, say, 3%, that has a bigger impact on the CPI than food, and has a much bigger impact than if there's a 3% increase in education prices, because they receive a higher weighting in the CPI and they're a higher percentage of our total expenditure. The weightings of these items: each item in the regimen is weighted according to its relative importance to overall household expenditure. So products that we buy frequently that make up a higher proportion of our total income or our total spending have a greater impact on the CPI. Things that are expensive or frequently purchased that make up a higher proportion of our income or our spending have a bigger impact on the CPI. Less significant items have a smaller weight. So things that we spend less of our money on have a smaller weight in the index. So if you look at the weightings for the index, you can see that at the moment housing is about 22%, food and alcohol just under 17%. The third highest is recreation and culture. So what that's saying is that 22% of our expenditure goes towards housing. 16% of our expenditure goes towards food and alcohol. And as you can see, these figures are a bit old, but this measures the change in the prices within that category. So whether the prices have gone up in that category. Review of weightings: every 5 years they review the weightings. Okay, so due to the weightings, a 10% increase in the price of housing has a bigger impact than the 10% price of education. But the weightings are reviewed every year because our spending patterns are changing all the time. So the weightings of some of these items goes up because they represent a high proportion of our income in 5 years. So because housing prices continually go up, housing is probably going to have an even bigger weighting in 5 to 10 years, where something like alcohol and tobacco may go down in the next 5 years because we spend a smaller proportion of our income in those areas. So when you're talking about, if you've got a question that asks you to define inflation and then explain how inflation is calculated using the CPI, the key things you want to do is that the goal of inflation is 2 to 3% over the course of the business cycle, and then you need to explain how the CPI is calculated. So it's an index, and we'll talk about what that means a bit more in class. but is calculated by measuring the retail prices of locally made and foreign goods and services consumed by Australians. They go out and they survey retail outlets on 100,000 different goods and services that make up a high proportion of our expenditure. Prices are surveyed quarterly, so they determine whether prices are going up every quarter. They only survey retail outlets in metropolitan regions, not in the country. The 100,000 items are placed into 11 different categories, and these items are referred to as the regimen, okay, which is all the goods and services included. The regimen is weighted according to the proportion of household income spent on each category and is reviewed every 5 years to ensure it remains representative of what we're actually buying. They're the steps you need to explain in terms of how the CPI is calculated. Reference to the regimen, reference to retail outlets being surveyed every 3 months, the number of goods in the regimen, which is $100,000, how they weight goods within the regimen to make sure that those things that we spend more money on are weighted higher in terms of their impact of price changes on inflation. Limitations of CPI statistics. So there are problems with using the CPI. Some of those problems include that the lack of representativeness of the regimen. So some households may not even buy some of the goods in the CPI. So, if the CPI goes up because of tobacco prices increasing and you don't smoke, well, that doesn't have a big impact on your purchasing power. So it's not reflective of your spending. The weightings are not subjective to everyone's spending. Okay, there are things, so this one here is more about, that there are things not included in the CPI that people buy, so that would affect their purchasing power. The second one is the weightings aren't reflective of everyone. The third one is that retail outlets aren't necessarily, it's not indicative of the general price changes, so their prices might be going up or down, but they might not be indicative of all the retail outlets. They're only surveying some retail outlets. And another problem is that some inflation is caused by quality improvements, and the CPI doesn't account for that. So, it's not really inflation if something's going up in price just because the quality is better. That's something a bit different. So that overstates inflation a little bit.